Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is David Woodard from the Department of Political Science at Clemson University. My colleague and I, Bruce Ransom, are reporting on our Palmetto Poll that we've been offering for a number of years here. We'd like to thank Clemson for its support in this and also our college for backing us in this particular endeavor. And with that, I'll turn it over to my friend Bruce Ransom, who'll give you the results of our poll.
Okay, good morning and thank you, Dave. The Palmetto Poll has been around for quite some time. We began in 1999. We were a project of the Strom Thurmond Institute at the time, and as my colleague mentioned, we're now in the College of Social Behavior and Health Sciences. And we're here this morning to report on our most recent, more or less hot off the presses, if you will, Palmetto Poll. We came out of the field Tuesday night. My colleague will talk about our methodology and et cetera in a few minutes. But what I want to do is make some comments about the horse race. Everyone coming down to the last days before the primary vote, the Democratic presidential primary voting in South Carolina on Saturday the 29th. The Palmetto Poll is reporting that the first in the South, South Carolina Democratic presidential primary, is has found that Joe Biden is perched to achieve his goal of South Carolina becoming a firewall. Unlike recent polls that typically have indicated Biden in the lead, but by a close margin, around 26% or so, some a little higher, some somewhat lower. And even my colleague, Dr. Steve Miller, in a social media poll back in November, December, I think, if I have the time right, was also in that range. Our poll, however, has Joe Biden coming in with more than 1/3, 35% to be exact, the vote, potential vote, likely vote among those who've indicated they will vote in the Democratic presidential primary on this coming Saturday. Also, another surprise is Tom Steyer, who we've probably all familiar with, nothing more about his ads. He comes in at second in our poll with 17%. And of course, ahead of Bernie Sanders, who comes in at 13%. In terms of the remaining ones that we want to, I guess, at least mention, is Pete Buttigieg and Elizabeth Warren both come in at 8%. So in terms of what we have found, we are a little higher than more recent polls. We have full confidence our methodology is going to prove to be
faultless
in this process. The Palmetto Poll, as I indicated, has been around since 1999. We are a poll that surveys statewide. We more often look at campaigns and elections, trying to determine South Carolina voters, residents in some cases, preferences, and positions on issues, but also candidates in terms of campaigns and elections. And so in that regard, this poll is in keeping with recent polls. In the past, we've also polled in particular issue areas. This poll is not obviously one of those, but hopefully in the future we'll be able to do that as well and continue our new partnership with the social media listening center in that regard. But having said that, Dave, can you give us something about the methodology and some of the other issues?
I don't want us to beat our chest too much, but in the years Bruce and I have been doing this, we've always called it right. And I think one of the reasons why is because our sample is from voters who voted in the last primary, new voters who registered since that primary, in other words, voted in 2018 after 2016 primary, and voters that we contact and they say they're going to vote in the upcoming primary. And as a result of that, several times, Bruce and I have made very correct calls where other polls have been off by substantial margin just by asking people, are you going to vote? When we first started doing this 20 years ago, we were on the telephones exclusively. But since then, the world has changed, and we now work in a mixture where we have a panel study, online responses, and telephone responses. We mix them all together and get a good reading, I think a better reading than we ever got in the past, on who's going to vote where. And we both spent time in the call center. There's a lot you can learn from people responding on the telephone. And we have great confidence that even though this is kind of out of step with some other polls, it's right in step with how people are going to vote here in South Carolina. We found out some other things about this. The main thing that seems to be motivating Democrats, and this is no news, is their desire for strong leadership and their desire to have somebody who cares about them. And they feel like this is the case from the Democratic candidates that they're hearing from. And even though lots of people have heard of Michael Bloomberg, up to 92% of the people we surveyed said they had heard of him, the support for him was kind of mixed. It was about a third had a positive view, third neutral, and then a third not really interested in him or opposed to him. It's interesting to see that Tom Steyer, who comes in second in our poll, seems to have a lot more reserve amongst the voters than does Bloomberg. And I think that's sort of interesting. Steyer has not been on the radar at any other primary up until this one, but those of us who live here know how he's been on television and been visiting around, and we think he's going to be a presence here in the South Carolina primary. So, let's see, most important leadership, poor leadership in government, that's the most important issue that people were talking about. Obviously, dislike for Trump, desire to have something else, beating out health care. The role of the economy was not that impressive. We found that about half the people thought the economy was getting worse, and about the same number, 40%, thought it was staying about the same. There was no, the economy's getting better, that reflected among Democratic voters in our poll. And the impeachment proceedings were about the same way. We found out that, for instance, most of the people made up their minds right after, even before the first primary, and certainly right after the first primary, as to who they were going to vote for. Oftentimes in these primaries in South Carolina, we have people just days before the election who don't know who's running and don't seem to be cared. But in this particular case, people had made up their minds early, and they didn't seem to stray too much from them. But the majority said that impeachment hearings had no effect on their decision to participate, and but 40% said it made them more likely that they would participate. So, I mean, the impeachment hearings may have had some effect, but they don't have the effect that we frequently read in the media that they're going to have this effect. We find in the years that Bruce and I have been polling the South Carolina electorate that people are pretty reserved. They're pretty confident in what they're going to do. And this idea that's been in the press a lot about a crossover vote didn't seem to be very much in the minds of most people. We call voters who vote in Democratic primaries, we can't identify crossover voters. But we sort of suspect, based on our experience, that there won't be a lot of crossover voting, because most of the time our voters don't consider that fair. Now, that may sound sort of old-fashioned, but that's the way the electorate is in South Carolina in both parties, and we've found it repeatedly. Something else you'd like to enlighten us on?
I think that's about it. That's about it.
That's our summary. All that. Anybody have any questions?
For this go around, when did you guys actually start the poll and all that?
Let's see, we started the 17th. We finished the 25th. We've been in the field all day and night. I mean, since then. The online you can do during the day. The margin of error is plus or minus 3.8% for that size. 650 voters, and everybody in our poll had voted before and said they were going to vote again. That's one reason we have confidence. Is that helpful? Did I answer your question?
What do you say to those who, for whatever reason, might be a bit skeptical of polls? You expressed your confidence in your findings. Can you explain to folks who might be a little wary or might say, well, you know, that very well might be the case, but at the same time, folks could lie and folks can change their mind. How does that factor into the compilation of the Palmetto Poll, and if so, how?
Well,
Go ahead.
Well, of course, as Dave has already said, we try to be accurate. It's based on our methodology. And 2016 polls took a heavy beating, if you will. But at the same time, a poll is only a snapshot in time. And so it's for that period of time, and we're projecting from that what's going to happen this Saturday. And even though it's a few days before next Saturday, that's another point in our period in time. And so we always have to keep in mind that though we generalize beyond the day that we were in the field collecting the data, the poll is really a reflection of a point in time. And we try to be as accurate as we can, and that's why he spent so much time talking about our methodology.
I think we've been pretty accurate in South Carolina, but we don't have the problem trying to predict 50 states and how that's going to come. That's much more difficult. But I think we have been pretty good in understanding our electorate. Over the years, we've worked together now for 20 years and done a number of polls together, and we've sort of formed an opinion about the electorate that really hasn't changed, and that it's pretty responsible. They play pretty fair. They usually turn out, and like I said, we've been right on target most of the time. How's that?
You were saying there were some surprising things. You mentioned Steyer, you mentioned Bloomberg. Was there anything unique, either in this partnership or in the results in general, that kind of struck you two gentlemen about this particular race?
I think the first night, Bruce and I were talking mostly about Steyer. Mm-hmm. We were both impressed that he had run television commercials. We'd seen them. We didn't think they were going to have the effect that they did. When we started calling that first night, we were surprised at the strength Steyer had. Like I said, he's finished second. Now, Bernie Sanders has come in. He's done well in Nevada. I mean, he may have enough, and it's going to be a catfight between the two of them to the end. But I think Steyer's strength and the failing of people like Buttigieg and Elizabeth Warren not being really significant players, even though they're significant players on the national stage, was kind of surprising. I was not surprised to find Biden ahead. He's been on campus here. He gave an eulogy at Strom Thurmond's funeral and Fritz Hollings' funeral, two former senators. He's been in South Carolina many times, and I think he has a base of support here. Plus, you have to remember that 57% of our voters were African American, and Biden was Barack Obama's vice president, and I think people appreciated him for that. It was clear from the beginning. Biden led our poll from the beginning. He's never been behind.
But I have to echo, if I can, what you just said. And I have been following Steyer relatively, well, closely, really, since, I guess, the first of the year, late December of 2019, he started to surge. And he has maintained that level, and the question I always had was, would it continue? And I still want to know, even without findings.
Yeah, that's right.
Will it continue to Saturday?
Yeah,
Right.
I think we're all wondering.
And we'll see what happens afterwards, because in my estimation, and maybe perhaps I haven't been as comprehensive as I should have been, I'll admit that, but this is the only state in which he's doing this well. He's on the air, and everyone talks about that and the amount of money that he spends, and he's doing that nationally and elsewhere as well. But also in South Carolina, he has had a ground game in South Carolina with 80 or more paid and volunteer workers when he's not in the state, going around, going into communities, not just the larger cities in the state, but the small towns and rural counties, talking to people about their concerns in their neighborhoods, in their communities. And I've talked to several national reporters looking for background information before they come into the state, and when they've called me, several of them have indicated they are joining his campaign, not in terms of support, but let's say flying into a city, let's say Florence in in the PD, for example, and then traveling to towns and counties in that area, and finally ending up in Columbia. Some of them are very small communities, but they're on his list. And so it doesn't matter about the size of the population. He's out speaking to people, which the word spreads, even if the people don't see them himself. They've heard that they were in, and they're just surprised and pleased that they get this attention. So there are a number of factors at play, but he's been pretty aggressive, not just in the air, but in terms of making a presence, and his staff and volunteers and paid are doing the same thing, and have been doing so well in advance of the most recent weeks.
How did you guys kind of combine social media analytics with the traditional polling that you guys typically usually do in years past?
I think it was mostly in our question selection and how we went about it there. They gave us all kinds of information as to what the chatter was out there. Of course, we all watch television. We're not surprised by what they were saying. But for instance, things like crossover voting and other things like that were something we were very nervous about, frankly, as we began, because it was so much in the social media. But I think the difference between us and them is we're looking at voters and how voters are going to vote. And the social media can be for anybody just talking about anything, anywhere. We don't know very much about their background, whether or not they're registered, whether or not they're going to vote. But certainly the chatter has an effect on other people who are going to vote. And I think it set the mood for us to come up with better questions. Can you think of anything?
Well, I want to add another point. Our colleague, Steve Miller, has actually tried to do, some actual surveying. I think 500 and plus potential Democratic voters back in the fall, as I mentioned in my earlier comments. And so trying to, through that mechanism, replicate what we are doing here, and we can compare, and we talked about questions beforehand and that sort of thing. And so trying to not walk away from this approach, but to combine the two and have a much better product and insight with what we both come up with and combine our efforts.
You mentioned demographics breakdown a little bit. Along with race, did you also consider age and gender? And if so, could you kind of give some overviews on that?
Yeah, sure. It's a heavy sample on gender weighted to females. 65-35, 65% female, 57% black. I think there weren't any other real differences that stood out, except if you know voters, and especially if you know primaries, you know that young voters usually don't participate. So these national stories about Bernie Sanders exciting the youth vote, well, for those of us who study elections, we know that's not really good, because that's the lowest level of voters. But we were surprised to find that Bernie Sanders had some support among people in their 40s and even older here. That I mean, again, he's third in our poll, but I mean, he has more than just youth support, I think is what we're finding out. Again, neither one of us, we'll stand by our results. We think he's in third. And look, you never can tell what's going to happen in the next 3 or 4 days. And the president is coming, and I'm sure he's going to encourage crossover voting. There's going to be a lot of stuff we can't control. But right now, Bernie Sanders didn't have the support that he seems to have nationally here, where Joe Biden did, and Tom Steyer was a surprising personality in a different way. And some of the others who have been on the stage and in the news are really pretty far down the list in terms of winning, or really getting in the top 3, we think.
Can y'all explain where you made the majority of your contacts with people, majority in the upstate, majority in the PD, majority in the low country?
We have a sample of nearly 300,000 people who have voted in 2016 and in 2018 who are new voters. That is not proportionate to where all the population is. The upstate is more Republican than the low country, but we call on that. These are voters who vote in Democratic primaries. So there probably is a geographical basis downstate more than in the upstate. And like we said, it was heavily weighted toward older females. When when you're polling, one of the first things you learn is that older voters are there to answer their phones and give you all your answers. It's chasing those 21-year-old males that's hard. And we were able to get, you know, a full representation of the people in the overall sample. You know, that's why I think our methodology has been true, but it's been good for South Carolina. I would not want to do Georgia or Tennessee. They're completely different places.
A quick rundown of the social media platforms that came into play in this first time that you considered the social media lab. Was it so much the platforms?
If truth be told, we had an issues question in here. That's where we got a lot of that. What are the issues? What issues motivated you? One of the problems of polling is that sometimes as you go through the questionnaire, people will talk to you up to a point and then they kind of get confused or don't. So we had to kill that question. That's the short answer to it. I wish I had more of an answer to that, but we were generating the issues from social media and also the opinions of the candidates, the things about feels the same way I do, is a strong leader. Those kind of things came from social media discussions about that's why they liked somebody. So that's why we put those in there. We only had 4 or 5 descriptions for people to give why they chose somebody. We didn't want them just launching out, oh, I like the way he looks in a blue shirt or something. We wanted to try and focus them, and we did. I think we got pretty good information. Strong leader was the main thing. And they feel like, the voters in the Democratic Party feel like that Joe Biden is a strong leader and has a proven record. And I mean, I know that's not a popular thing to say, given what goes on in the press every day, but to South Carolina voters, he has real standing. And we can't negate that.
And for clarity's sake, when you gentlemen say social media, do you mean Facebook, Twitter, Instagram? What specific platforms do you have?
Well, we defer to our
Well,
colleagues.
I'll defer to our colleagues who know more about it than we do, but we always take their findings and use them to help us. I guess.
Yeah, we're not trying to replicate what they do, but we're trying to benefit from what they have unearthed.
So they presented their findings to you, and from there,
Right,
you were able to
and
file.
we talk about they talk about the chatter, what they're hearing, as he pointed out, and then we decide whether that's something we want to pursue in terms of our questioning. And the same thing on the other side. We talked to Dr. Miller when he went in the field about questions, and that's the most important contribution. But the chatter is something that we've never had access to before.
Right.
I see.
That was a real asset to us. Well,
Anything else you gentlemen would like to add?
No, I'm fine. I hope you got what you need.
one point in time.
Please keep that in mind. Although we're going to project, remind you
We've
of that.
never been wrong.
We remind you of that, then we say,
Just
but
remember, we called it for Biden. So when it's over, that's all that
so
matters.
that's another point in time.
So if you would like to talk with them individually, we can set that up right now. And then we've also got Will and Stephen here who can answer questions on the social media front.
Heather, they're wondering where the donuts are.
You never leave right before that.